This popular snack is as toxic as poison ivy. It's as valuable as Taylor Swift, and it's sometimes used in lubricants. Gross. In this episode of So Where's It From? We're looking at the bizarre story of one of the world's most mysterious nuts. And here's the thing, it's not even a nut, it's a seed. Sort of. To tell this story, I've come to the nuttiest islands in the Philippines, known for their production of this crescent-shaped kernel, the humble cashew nut. Surprisingly, cashews didn't even originate in the Philippines, which makes their story even more juicy. This fascinating tale involves indigenous traditions, 16th century colonizers, rapid global expansion, and even greedy elephants. If I had the time, I'd be taking you to India, Vietnam, Mozambique, and Brazil. But luckily, the Philippines has everything I need. Right, we've just landed in Busoanga, which is here on a map, if you're looking. And today I get to meet a cashew wizard. This
Don't touch any of the oil, okay?
is Raul,
That's toxic.
our cashew wizard.
The shell will expand.
He's a former media exec who moved to Coron to get out of the corporate life, got into cashews because of COVID, and now runs the only semi-automated cashew facility in the entire country. Within minutes of us meeting, he's whisked me down to the port of Coron town to pick up some newly delivered cashews.
These are guys who aggregate from the different islands.
Turns out, many neighbouring islands inhabited by the Tagbanua people also have cashews. Raul often sources from them, but deliveries depend on the weather and island time. Either way, it's a family effort that involves plenty of heavy lifting.
How heavy are these, bro?
60?
That's not easy.
What I expect to see were the mini croissant-shaped nuts that I know, but they look very different. And it leads me to think, what actually is a cashew?
Yeah, one poking out there.
How does it grow? And why does it kind of look like a dead toenail? So, a cashew,
An Arcadium occidentale.
that's its Latin name, is a tropical tree producing both cashew nuts and a fruit called a cashew apple. However, what we call the cashew nut is actually a seed that grows outside the fruit rather than inside the fruit like most seeds. It's a bit of a botanical identity crisis, because the fruit isn't really a fruit, it's a pseudo-fruit that we call an apple. And the seed is actually the fruit that we call a nut. And it turns out it's toxic. Right. To help understand and visualize all this, Raul has taken me to a community of cashew gatherers just outside the town of Coron.
We're now heading to the east side of the island. The town is called Marsilia, and this is where a lot of the wild trees are.
As we drive to Marsilia, I'm kind of struck by how beautiful yet incredibly dry it is. And I can't help but wonder, how on earth do cashews grow here? After making a quick stop in the village for another collection, we meet Ruperta, one of Raul's cashew crew, who escorts us down this track for another 15 minutes until we get to this hidden cashew grove tucked behind a hill. By this point, Raul has explained a few key things. First off, cashews kinda like to suffer, and they thrive in tough conditions. Sandy, rocky soil and dry tropical climates are ideal. In other words, Coron is the perfect place for them. At the grove, our cashew ates have assembled, ready to show us how cashew nuts are harvested. After some quick intros,
Marilu, nice to meet you, Marilu.
we dive right in. First things first, these are cashew trees. They don't grow very tall, and they're part of the same family as poison ivy. More on that later. They produce small pinkish white flowers that, once pollinated, develop into a green kidney-shaped pod, which is actually the true fruit. The stem above the pod then swells to produce the cashew apple, called a false fruit. Because botanically, a true fruit has got to have a seed inside. Apparently. As the apple grows, the seed hardens, changes colour, and once fully ripe, the whole thing drops naturally to the ground. That's when it's ready for harvest. At this point, the cashew apple is edible. And the flavour? A mix of mangoes, cucumber, and maybe strawberries? It's sweet,
Super juicy,
nutty,
but that dries your mouth out.
and slightly tanniny.
So weird.
In the Philippines, and many other countries, there's not really an industry to process the fruit due to its short shelf life. As a result, it's mostly thrown away, and only the nuts are harvested. Now we're back to these dead toenail-looking cashew seeds, but we still can't eat them. In fact, we haven't even reached the toxic part, so it's back to Raoul's factory for processing. Right, let me just pause for a second there, because we now know what cashews are, but we still don't know how they got to the Philippines and where they actually come from. Cashews are now grown in loads of countries. According to the Global Cashew Council, the largest producers are often Ivory Coast, India, and Vietnam. Philippines is top 5, so that ain't bad, but here's the twist. Cashews didn't originally come from any of these countries. Long before they became a global snack, these curious little kernels had their roots in Brazil. How do we know that? Well, science, and because of the indigenous Tupi community. So, in the 1500s, when you've got European colonizers all over South America and maps looked a bit more basic, this guy comes along. André Tebet. Bonjour. A French naturalist and colonizer who was pretty horrible with his descriptions, but during his time in Brazil documented a great number of trees called cashews, producing fruits as big as fists. And some people make a certain drink from them. The some he was describing were the indigenous Tupi, and he even tries to illustrate them harvesting the fruit. He continues and writes, "At the end of this fruit grows a kind of nut with a kernel inside that is excellent to eat, provided it has been lightly roasted over a fire." That is a pretty strong indication that the Tupi had been doing this whole cashew thing for a very long time. Now, Brazil is a big place, so this is where it gets tricky. Due to natural dispersion and human involvement, no one can pinpoint exactly in Brazil or on the continent where cashews hail from. So, it's suggested that they're either from the savannas of central Brazil or the sandy coastal regions of northeastern Brazil. Either way, that is the cashew's starting point. And its next stop? Well, we'll get there in a minute, but first, it's back to Raoul's factory.
So we sun dry it until it gets to about 9% moisture content.
Processing cashews to make them edible involves quite a few steps. They're sun-dried in the toxic husks, then separated according to size by this machine, before they can be stored for processing.
After that, the first step in the process, after storage, is to cook it.
The cashews are then steamed in this giant yellow cooker because if you heat the cashews up,
The shell will expand and the kernel will separate, so it's easier for us to cut through.
they're then left to cool naturally before being fed into this nifty little machine, which cracks the cashew shells just enough to open them without breaking the kernel inside. From there, they're jiggled along this separator where some of the husk is shaken away. The final intact kernel is then separated from any remaining husk. But you'll notice, everyone handling them is wearing gloves, and it's for a very good reason. Remember when I mentioned cashews are in the same family as poison ivy? Well, this is when it becomes a real problem, because the oil released from the cashew shells is so toxic that it burns your skin. Mechanizing this whole process and using gloves can avoid serious harm, but unfortunately, some factories lack proper safety measures. A news feature by France 24 in 2020 demonstrated the painful impact of cashew oil exposure on workers. And it isn't just certain countries that are to blame. The problem lies with safety standards, the high demand of cashews around the world, and the quotas that workers need to hit. And apparently, gloves slow things down. Luckily though, this isn't the case with Raoul's factory. Once we've got the nice intact cashew, it's still got this thin skin which needs removing. So they're dried in these giant dryers.
At 75 degrees Celsius for 6 to 7 hours.
Then they're humidified, dried again, and finally blasted with filtered air to remove that now flaky skin. The last few steps involve sorting by size and quality, then removing the last few bits of that skin. They're then sold as either raw cashew kernels or they're roasted and sold in their own packaging. Now, before the cashew industry became what it is today, these little kernels went on the most insane journey around the world. By the mid-1500s, Portugal was well into colonizing parts of East Africa and South Asia. Having seen cashews being harvested by indigenous Brazilians, the Portuguese decided to introduce them to one of their other colonies, now known as Mozambique. In East Africa, cashews were cultivated, but many were spread naturally by animals, especially those sneaky elephants. Turns out, elephants love colourful fruit. They likely swallowed the cashew apples whole, and since the seeds would have been too tough to digest, they were spread via their dung. On a side note, Mozambique is actually where I first started really thinking about cashews. I saw them being sold all along the roadside whilst driving to the island of Mozambique. Now you might be thinking, Ross, Mozambique isn't an island, and you're not wrong, sort of. The country's name actually comes from this island because it acted as the capital of Portuguese East Africa for nearly 400 years. According to the USDA, for most of the 20th century, Mozambique was the world's largest cashew producing country. Sadly, the civil war in the 70s and World Bank policies in the 90s kind of ruined this. But nowadays, the country is still a massive producer. Okay, back to the history. So, after introducing cashews to East Africa, the Portuguese brought them to another one of their newly established colonies on the southwest coast of India. What's crazy is that this all happened really fast, because by 1596, Dutch colonizer and mapmaker Jan Huygen van Linschoten was already documenting cashews in Goa. In southwest India, cashew trees were initially planted to prevent coastal erosion. Their potential wasn't totally realized, but they thrived in the climate, and locals soon discovered their culinary and medicinal value. From India, cashews spread across Southeast Asia, and it was all thanks to traders, birds, and even monkeys. In Vietnam, it was apparently the French who introduced cashews in the 1800s, though they might have been there before. As for Ivory Coast, cashews arrived much later, in the 1900s, as a result of French colonial agricultural policies. But what about the Philippines? Well, no one seems to have a definite answer on this. So they either came over via Southeast Asia, where they'd spread from India, or they came the other way, via Mexico, brought over by the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. What's really quite wonderful is that despite traveling for centuries across continents and cultures, the cashew has kept its indigenous name in a bunch of languages. In Portuguese, it's cashew. In Hindi, cashew. French, cashew. Malayalam, cashewvandi. And even Japanese, cashew. And it all comes from the indigenous Tupi word, acashew. Translations aside, cashews have many uses, and they're way more than just a simple snack. And we know this because they've been incorporated into a bunch of dishes around the world. In Mozambique, matapa de siri-siri is a dish that combines a boiled seaside succulent with a mix of ground peanuts, coconut milk, and cashews. I tried it when I was in Mozambique, and although it sounds unusual, it's damn tasty. The cashewness really pulls through. In Brazil, they don't waste that cashew apple, and they make doce de caju, which is basically steamed or caramelized cashew apples, sometimes accompanied by a little biscuit-like shortbread. In India, cashew katli is one of the many ways cashews are consumed. It's a sweet, often eaten during Diwali, made by grounding soaked cashews into a paste, which is then cooked with sugar to form a dough, rolled out and cut into diamond-shaped pieces. In vegan products, I'm sure many of you know that cashews are used all the time, especially in things like dairy replacements. When I visited Raoul and Coron, they were looking into starting their own vegan cheese, alongside their already very popular cashew butter. Now, what about that toxic liquid? Well, turns out it's not just a nuisance. In fact, it's pretty big business. In some countries, cashew nut shell liquid, CNSL, is extracted from shells, and it's used in things like adhesives, paints, lubricants, and sometimes in the brake pads of cars. Now, the important question: how are cashews more valuable than Taylor Swift? Well, according to the internet, Taylor Swift's net worth is estimated to be about $1.6 billion US, whilst the global cashew industry is worth over $9 billion, which means you get about 5.5 Taylor Swifts for the whole of the global cashew industry. Sounds impressive, but I should add that as valuable as the cashew industry is, it's got plenty of problems. Many workers face unsafe conditions and unfair pay, and most cashews that are sold are not fair trade certified. Beyond labour issues, the ecological footprint is massive. West and East Africa grow half of the world's cashews, but most are shipped thousands of miles for processing, then shipped thousands of miles back to be sold. This means fewer jobs and less money for the communities and countries that actually grow them. What can we do? Well, we as consumers don't have to choose between healthy foods and fair working conditions. Initiatives like Fair Trade, the Rainforest Alliance, and the Sustainable Nut Initiative work to make cashew farming a lot more ethical. One way we can all help is by buying through brands that follow fair trade principles, like Equal Exchange, Karma Nuts, and if you're in the Philippines, Raoul's brand, the Palawan Cashew Company. At the end of the day, every purchase is a choice and a chance to support businesses that treat workers fairly, whilst also protecting the environment. From indigenous communities in Brazil to entrepreneurs in the Philippines, the cashew story is pretty nuts. So, next time you grab a handful of cashews, think about the journey they've been on, why they're so expensive, and perhaps where they come from.